Episode 29 is a continuation of episode 28. So I kindly request you to first listen to episode 28 so that you can very well connect with the conversation in episode 29. Thank you and enjoy the episode. So, what are the key motivations of France
Yes.
in intervening in the African countries?
Oh, yes, of course. So when we talk about intervention, especially the French intervention, I think it depends greatly on the country. But in this specific case, let me talk about the Sahel and the counterterrorism operation, the French counterterrorism operations there. So when I'm talking about the Sahel, I mean Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso mainly. And these countries actually, ten, less than 10 years ago, they needed the French to protect their national interests. As I've given you the example of the French intervening to support the Malian government to regain northern regions, for example. So the French were able actually to protect these countries and sort of support the state sovereignty, and allow these nations to access their national resources as opposed to jihadis accessing these resources. Also protect trade routes between the countries, and limit or stop the smuggling of people, arms, and goods from Niger to Mali to Algeria. The smuggling route is very well known there. But when it comes to the French, I think the main motivation was the regional and global security reason. So because Africa is approximately close to Europe, and France sees itself as accountable for protecting Europe from jihadism originating there. Um, because France sees that the presence and expansion of jihadis, whether it was in Mali or any Sahel region, will eventually have implications on the regional and global security. So you could think of the Operation Barkhane and the French intervention and overstaying in Mali as a preemptive measure to limit the escalation of jihadis that might affect Europe, and actually will for sure affect Europe. And this is the reason that the French used to involve the European countries in the counterterrorism operation, the Takuba Task Force. They were able to convince these countries by saying that you are intervening here to protect the for the regional and global security. Um, and France is always talking about wanting to attack terrorism at home, and to tackle jihadism as its roots, and to prevent attacks in European countries, and France specifically. And also by weakening, if you think about it, by weakening these jihadist groups and structures, it becomes it becomes more unlikely for these groups to influence sympathizers in Europe, in European countries. That's why we are seeing European countries intervening in Africa, because that would limit the influence that these jihadis have on young people, and will eventually end or limit attacks, that jihadi attacks or terrorist attacks in European countries, similar to the attacks that we used to see in France and Belgium, for example.
Yes.
However, in recently, like in the last year probably, Al-Qaeda Emir in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Annabi, have stated that Al-Qaeda and JNIM, the Al-Qaeda branch in the Sahel region, he said that the group will not be attacking France, or will not be attacking French on European soil. However, they are a target for the group as long as they are on African soil. So the Al-Qaeda attacks in Europe will probably not happen as, you know, as organized attacks from Al-Qaeda, but Al-Annabi made it clear that the French will remain a target for this group as long as they are in Africa. In some cases, and this is not related to Africa or Sahel, in some cases, foreign intervention is also very crucial to end severe human rights violations. And this is an example for Syria. So you see that foreign intervention in Syria following the Islamic State attacks and expansion in Mosul, in Iraq, and Syria, and the atrocities that were conducted against the Yazidis. The foreign intervention was needed here to end that massacre and end the suffering of the Yazidis.
Yes. Yep. I mean, you mentioned about Yazidis. I was recently speaking to one of my friends, and I mean, like, I have not a lot of people know, but I am into like screenplay writing as well. I don't do it on a commercial basis,
Oh,
but
nice.
yeah. So, so I'm picking up a topic on
Yeah.
Yazidis, and
Oh,
making
that's interesting.
try to write a script on a short film based on Yazidi community. But we'll see how things go. But it's quite interesting to
That's
see,
quite
how things.
interesting.
Yeah. The thing is, like, we are all, as a journalist, I'm also a former journalist.
Yeah,
Writing is something that we have to do. It's our bread and butter, and it's a passion as well. So I'm
exactly.
just
Yes.
trying to, yeah. So I'm just trying to, diversify wherever I can, express the things, because not all emotional things you cannot express, through a formal writing in opinion pieces.
No,
Uh,
absolutely, absolutely.
yeah. So films are something, films, TV shows, writing, or doing a script writing for this kind of
Yeah,
segment helps, take out all your emotional burden out.
of course,
So
of course.
yes, definitely. So I'm trying to,
No, absolutely.
develop the
That's very
script. Yeah.
impressive.
Yes, yes. Maybe
Y-
I'll get in touch with you possibly
Please do.
to,
No,
yeah,
please do.
yeah.
If you
Yes,
like, I
yes.
don't know, talk to some
Yeah, yeah.
sources, listen to some testimonies, absolutely, I can connect you with
Yeah,
some people. I write
definitely,
short
definitely.
stories, and this is like whenever I'm like fed up with analysis and news and all of that, I write short stories. It's my
Nice,
thing as
nice.
well. Yeah.
Yes, yes. We all have these hobbies. So yeah, I
Exactly.
mean, yeah. So just to continue with the conversation, I mean, we spoke about the failures primarily of France, where they have failed, and in what ways. You explained in a very extensive manner. I'm glad you did, because this is the perspective really needed. But looking it from the other lens,
Mm,
can you tell us some successful instances where foreign
yeah.
forces, not specifically France, but anyone, where foreign
Yes,
forces have
absolutely,
collaborated
absolutely.
effectively with the local government to counter terrorism in Africa?
No, of course, of course. That's an excellent question. So, there's no like it's good. I mean, there's no absolute success. That's how I view it, especially when it comes to long-term deployments. There will always be some sort of controversy. Um, so to go back to Mali, I mean, yes, we talked about the failure of Operation Barkhane, but also there was some success there. So as I mentioned, so the French intervention or Operation Barkhane was able to neutralize key jihadi leaders, especially Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Amir Drukdel, and the IS founder Abu Walid al-Sahrawi. However, as we discussed, this did not change how these jihadi groups operate, but it was important to eliminate these leaders. To talk about success, maybe in this case we can talk about, when we discuss foreign intervention, maybe we can also discuss African intervention.
Yes.
So African forces interfering in or making military action for the benefit of an African country. So we can talk here about, for example, ECOWAS and how it was involved in various interventions in African
Yes.
countries, mainly to end conflict, to bring about peace, to promote stability, to end the civil war. And there are a lot of examples, but again, like nothing comes without controversy. So to give you examples, back in the 90s, ECOWAS played actually an important role in ending the civil war in Liberia. And they were
Yes.
able to deploy a peacekeeping mission, which helped restoring stability and oversee the DDR process. So you could say that ECOWAS ended the civil war, or helped ending the civil war in Liberia. And of course, there were some challenges for the force in Liberia. As I mentioned, it's not an absolute success. Also in Sierra Leone, also back in the 90s, ECOWAS helped ending the civil war and helped disarm the rebel groups and that were in fight with the authorities there. The same goes for Cote d'Ivoire, where ECOWAS was involved in mediating efforts and deploying peacekeepers in the country. So there are some successful example, but they don't come without controversy, just to put it that way.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So, just moving ahead from this, generally, from your perspective, what challenges arise from the presence of multiple foreign forces concurrently engaged in terrorism efforts within the
Mm.
same African nation? That too.
So we have now multiple, in some countries, we have multiple forces deployed in one country. So we have in Niger, for example, we have the French, the
Yes.
American, and other European forces operating in the same country. Also in Libya, but every country is different. In Libya, for example, we can see that the different foreign forces have different objectives and strategies and agenda, etc. Also, in Niger, we have the same forces, but also the like to a lesser extent, there's no conflict, in Niger. It's not like Libya, so it's safer than Libya. But challenges could be the challenges that could arise from having too many forces in one country, could be in the coordination and communication between the forces and the host country, which could slow down the work or delay operations. There are actually several cases from Mali where lack of coordination between the French and the other European forces, so between Operation Barkhane and the Takuba Task Force, um, and also on one side, but also between these forces and the governments, that led to delays in deployment, or even diplomatic tension. We also have a case where Ivorian peacekeepers were sent to Mali without the approval of the Malian government, which led to the imprisonment of the Ivorian troops, but they were later released. So these challenges are mostly in communication and coordination. Um, this is from what I've seen in Mali. The other challenge could be in the local perception of these forces, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So the French have bad reputation in the Sahel and Mali, and there's like a strong
Yes.
anti-French sentiments brewing for so long in the Sahel. So that affects any other European force that cooperates with the French. So that sentiment translates to other European forces. So sometimes coordinating or working with the French could be an issue for the other European forces on the ground, because they have to also face the same negative sentiment and backlash, although they are not the same as the French. They don't have colonial histories there. Um, the other thing would be a risk of escalation and in violence, and here I'm not talking about the forces that are deployed under the same operation or working in synchronization. I'm talking about having conflicting forces. So, for example, having Wagner operatives operating in the same area where the French are or the US forces are. And this could, having two conflicting forces could lead to unnecessary clash, similar to what happened in Syria and Deir ez-Zor in 2018. In Mali, specifically, and before announcing the withdrawal of the British contingent of MINUSMA, the Russian pilots who were assisting the Malian armed forces have conducted airstrikes in very close proximity to the camp of the British contingent. So having Russians operating in that complex ecosystem is definitely would definitely impose danger and has imposed danger, and therefore we are seeing all the European forces withdrawing from Mali because they don't want that unnecessary clashes or tension between their forces and the Russians.
Okay. Oh, that's quite interesting. I mean, you also mentioned about how, uh, if one country comes in which has a colonial past, of course, and has no good reputation, it also affects the countries which don't really have
Cooperate.
any connection.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So it's quite interesting to see. So I believe like you need to keep a good track record. That's a kind of thing.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, because
Yes.
all your partners will have to bear your mistakes with you.
Yes.
Just to add a small thing to this point, I think now in Niger we are seeing an interesting dynamic between the US and the French. So when the coup started, the US and the French, as you probably know, they have bases there, they have forces there. They were sort of on the same page, and they both were against the junta, and they were both sort of pro the military intervention led by Nigeria. But starting from early this week, like last week and this week, we're seeing the US detaching itself completely from the French stance and actually working on a diplomatic solution with with the coup leaders in Niger, and sort of distancing itself from the French, to to not be associated with a colonial power, or a power that is perceived as colonial in this country. So it's actually an interesting dynamic to see now in Niger between the US and the French.
All right. Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting perspective. I mean, I believe every nation has that kind of thing, even though, your allies. This is one thing I believe has changed after World War II, or I would say primarily after Cold War. Uh,
Mm,
After the Soviet Union, got divided into different countries, I would say.
yeah,
So mainly people have started focusing on their own national interest. I mean, even though
of
United
course.
States is ally of Europe and Europe is ally of them, uh, everyone still has an independent stand. And I think, as you mentioned, US has started keeping some distance with French forces.
Yes,
And I believe this is something that has changed, because earlier, I think, after post World War II, things were more in a a collaborative and partnership fashion, that we have to be united, we have to be together no matter what. But I think things now, the perspective is more about self national interest,
of
rather than
course,
anything
exactly.
else. Yeah.
Exactly.
And
And that's why
yeah.
in Niger, you see that most of the protests are calling for the French to leave the country, and nobody's talking about the US. So, sort of like the US doesn't have the history that the French has. So the US is now like playing like a very smart game of disassociating completely from the French, making friends with the junta, and working on keeping its forces in Niger, while we might actually see in the coming I don't know, few weeks, months maybe, we might see a withdrawal of the French from Niger.
All right. Yeah. And just following up on the same things, like what lessons can be drawn from historical examples of foreign military involvement in Africa, especially when considering the future of counterterrorism strategies.
So when it comes to lessons, there are plenty of lessons. I think there are people who have like huge books on that. But
Okay.
from what I've seen, foreign forces should respect the national sovereignty of African countries. But we're talking about Africa specifically, and also respect, like we said, their customs, um, understand the differences between different communities, understand the traditions there, and foreign forces, especially the French, should focus on addressing the root causes of terrorism, as much as focusing on counterterrorism operations. They should also be working on prioritizing working with the local communities and institutions, so make their they have to make their efforts more holistic in a way. um, you can't
Yes.
just have a counterterrorism operation on the ground without the accompanied programs to limit the recruitment of jihadis, for example. um, Also, like I mentioned about the dialogue, if there is a space for local peace initiatives or agreement, the foreign forces should be open to it. They should be more pragmatic. They should understand that the jihadis that they're fighting, they are part of the communities, or were part of the communities of this country, and they could be reintegrated. So always leave a space for local peace initiatives. Um, and the most important thing probably is to give power to the African countries, engage them more in the counterterrorism operations, even let them lead on these operations. Um, I remember in Mali b- before the announcement of withdrawal of Operation Barkhane, the Malian armed forces were constantly trying to um, include itself in the Operation Barkhane statements by issuing statements saying that actually units of the Malian armed forces have contributed to this mission, have contributed to this operation. But you look at the Operation Barkhane statement, it doesn't mention at all any involvement of the Malian armed forces. Obviously, whoever wants to conduct CT operations or long-term deployments, they should be investing also in education, in creating economic opportunities, in providing reintegration programs. Also, like I mentioned, have effective communication, transparent communication to make the people understand that these foreign forces are there to help rather than inflict pain on the locals. Also to show them as a foreign operation in mission rather than an occupying force. Um, Also, they should be engaging with the local leadership, the tribesmen, the religious clerks. They need to understand how these communities work, which is different than how Western communities work. So Operation Barkhane, for example, I don't remember seeing Operation Barkhane in holding meetings with local leaderships, and although these leadership have actually power, have their say in their communities, people listen to them. If you look at Niger and Nigeria now, for example, so the coup leaders in Niger were refusing to meet the
Yes.
ECOWAS delegation. They actually refused to meet the ECOWAS delegation twice since the coup, and they were against engaging in dialogue with it. But then local clerics and traditional leaders and religious leaders from Nigeria, specifically from the Hausa ethnic group, visited Niger, talked with the coup leaders, and convinced them to enter dialogue with ECOWAS. So these leaders actually have more power than political leaderships, which is something that I think foreign forces are ignoring or not understanding properly.
All right. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, I would say. And I would like to just not focus, because that's not a topic, on China as well, because China's intervention in Africa is more from an economic perspective. So from
Exactly.
from that angle, I would like to just ask you, like, what diplomatic and geopolitical consideration come into play when foreign countries decide to withdraw or reduce their military presence in Africa. I mean, after successful
So,
counterterrorism effort.
yes, I mean, at the moment, from what, well, yes, let's talk about China a bit and then go back to ask to talk about the withdrawal of forces. Like you mentioned, China's engagement in Africa is driven by economic interest and strategic considerations. So China wants to access Africa's natural resources and minerals, and the whole agriculture products, all the natural resources that Africa has, and that's why we don't see a huge Chinese military presence in Africa, except for Djibouti. And even in Djibouti, they're only there to protect their interests, their economic interests, protect the ports that they've invested in and built even. But Africa definitely is an important trading partner, and it's a important market also for China, and this is how China behaves in general. They work on soft power rather than having boots on the ground. They always work on fostering diplomatic relations and having diplomatic influence in these countries. But to go back to your point, I think now the withdrawal of CT operations is not up to the forces anymore. It's becoming a national demand, um, if that makes sense. So it's actually not to France or anyone else to decide whether they want to stay or not, because it has already been decided on behalf of them. The only force that is having support, local support at the moment, is the Russian presence, which is concerning, obviously. But this is the first time the Africans are actually nationally demanding the presence of foreign force to support their respective countries.
These are very critical insights that you provided again on these issues. So, just to possibly take a step ahead, how can African nations strike a balance between utilizing foreign assistance in counterterrorism efforts and maintaining their sovereignty and self-reliance?
Yes, I mean, definitely striking a balance is very tricky, a tricky matter, and achieving that balance requires careful planning, cooperation, and like a whole comprehensive approach. There are some strategies the African countries can consider to achieve that balance. So African countries could, for example, which they are doing that now, they could reclaim the right to national CT operations. And by that, I mean conducting their own counterterrorism operations and plan their own national counterterrorism strategies that outline their security needs or priorities, and also let them lead on these operations. As I mentioned to you, that wasn't an option with Operation Barkhane, for example. They were always on the side assisting with the small aspect of that operation. African countries could also reduce the reliance on international forces, and work on building their national forces, and prioritize training for these forces on counterterrorism techniques and collection of intelligence. So instead of letting foreign forces lead and be the dominant force there, they should use the foreign forces assistance to build the capacities and acquire technological tools and expertise for them to conduct their own counterterrorism operations. They also need to probably, this is something that they could do gradually. They could reduce the dependencies on external support, and focus more on the local capabilities, on strengthening the local capabilities, which will ensure sort of like a seamless transition to the local authorities. African countries should also be working together, cooperating together to share intelligence and coordinate operations or even secure borders. They used to do that, but with all the polarization between pro West countries, African countries, and pro Russia African countries, with all that polarization and fragmentation and the coups that occurred in Mali and Burkina Faso and now in Niger, that cooperation have been reduced or even put to sleep. So there used to be a counterterrorism operation conducted by the G5 Sahel, which is an institutional framework for regional coordination and cooperation, but it's ineffective, and Mali was in fact kicked out of it since the coup. So as an organization, G5 Sahel has no weight on the ground at the moment. Um, Joined also African countries should seek funds to support their joint CT operation, and get the best out of the foreign forces in terms of training and building capacity. So the way I see it is that foreign forces or foreign assistance should support the African countries rather in their city operations, rather than dictating what these countries should be doing. And most importantly, don't let the foreign forces interfere in opportunities of dialogue between the African nations or states and the jihadis on the ground.
Interesting. And just because you have even the field experience, I was just curious from even the space technology perspective and even the terrestrial technologies as well. And please feel free to answer this question very briefly, because we are not focusing on the technology aspect. But still, I would like to know. I'm curious, like, what role does technology such as ISR, specifically intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and primarily intelligence sharing, play in enhancing the effectiveness of foreign counterterrorism initiatives in Africa?
So yes, like obviously technology and surveillance and intelligence sharing is very important in all CT operations, worldwide, globally, not just in Africa. But in Africa, we've seen that for example, the deployment of drones have massively enhanced the situational awareness, especially in difficult to operate areas, such as the tri-border area between Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, or the border area between MENA and Niger. And this is where the French drones, specifically the Reaper type, were very useful for the CT operations. The same goes for the radar systems, the GIS systems, the radio systems, reconnaissance aircraft. All of that was all of these were very important to enhancing the or gain the real-time situational awareness. Also, the technology helps collecting and analyzing intelligence data, and helped identifying trends and potential threats. And so, yeah, that's in general whatever I can say about technology and surveillance in this area.
All right, yeah. And are there any concerns about the long-term implications of foreign military presence in Africa, like such as potential backlash or unintended consequences for regional stability?
So we're actually now witnessing the consequences
Okay.
and backlash of that intervention. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I kind of feel that the whole rise of national sentiment in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and the fragmentation between African countries is a result of foreign military presence in Africa. Because, as I said, the French have overstayed their welcome. They did not listen to what the locals want. They did not deliver what they promised what they promised to deliver, and in return, people had to revolt. Not just people, but also military leaders, young military leaders, had to revolt against the governments that were cooperating with the French or foreign forces, and replace them with what they call a national agenda. So the backlash, all the anti-French negative sentiment that we have been brewing for so long is we're seeing now, or the effects of it, the consequences of it.
Yes. And, just moving ahead, I mean, from a futuristic perspective, I would say, what trends do you foresee in terms of foreign involvement in counterterrorism efforts in Africa, and how these developments might shape the future security landscape of the continent? I'm asking this question with respect to, because we are seeing a lot of intervention from the Wagner Group right now.
Yes.
So from that perspective, maybe you can tell us even, brief role of Turkey also. Even though briefly we can focus on this topic, but yeah, please feel free to, share the insights from your perspective.
Let me start from Turkey. So when it comes to Turkey, the interest of Turkey in Africa is very similar to the Chinese interest. So Turkey has a political, economic, and cultural interest in Africa, but also links to it, and it's also Africa Turkey aims to strengthen the economic relation with Africa, because it's a huge market for trade and construction and energy. And Turkey is also working on deploying humanitarian and development efforts in Africa, providing aid, education, opening organizations in some African countries, like in Niger. They're also working on strengthening their diplomatic ties with Africa, but at the same time, Turkey sees Africa as a market for its um, um, Bayraktar drone, which is an excellent drone with a very reasonable price. So that's why African countries are buying these drones from Turkey. So it's a great market for Turkey at this point. In terms of the trends that I'm seeing now is the rise of Wagner in the Sahel region. So we used to have Wagner in Africa before, but now the presence in the Sahel region is actually quite concerning, because the Sahel region is very close to is like bordering North Africa, and any destabilization in the Sahel will affect North Africa, which is relatively also very close to Europe, and will affect it because because it will increase the number of people migrating to Europe, for example, or increase the levels of terrorism and jihadism. So the future trends are Wagner involvement in the Sahel, the rise of national sentiment from African countries in the Sahel, like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and the fragmentation and polarization among African countries themselves. I hope that answered your
Yeah.
question, Omkar.
Yes, definitely. Like, thank you for these insights. And
Anytime.
primarily, I mean, we have reached the end of the podcast now. I'm pretty sure that there have been several questions which have popped up throughout the podcast, and definitely will be able to create future more episodes as the developments in this region takes place. But this
That would be
last
great.
question is
Mm-hmm.
specifically for students, because there are several students, research scholars, and experts who listen to the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to ask you, from your perspective, what message would you like to give to students and researchers pursuing, their respective research, I would say, in peace and conflict studies?
Um, well, maybe one thing probably is and this is something I've noticed in researchers, they spend lot of time, I mean, a lot of time focusing on media outlets and studying the theoretical part of conflict and peace and the diplomatic relation and international politics. I would advise students to also focus on the sentiment on social media and to follow the sources on the ground and to get the perspective from the people and incorporate it in their studies. So I guess my advice is, although maybe I'm not in a place to give anyone's advice, everyone has their own way of conducting research, but my advice would be to bridge the gap between the theoretical part and the practical part, and to keep an eye always on what people want, so to keep actually a finger of on the pulse of people, how they're feeling, how they're perceiving political and military development, and for them to be able to predict and forecast events, because all of the developments that we're seeing now have been talked about on social media by local sources, have been expressed by local sources, but the media outlet did not pick up on these alerts and did not report on it. So this is my one thing for students, if they would like to have my advice on this.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Aman, for providing these
Anytime.
insights. And I believe the audience is going to take a lot of key insights on this topic,
I
because we
hope
have
so.
never actually discussed anything about Africa. We have discussed about several other regions, and primarily about the counterterrorism perspective of Africa. This is something that was not discussed very well.
Yeah.
So this is the
We're
first
only
time that
scratching
we,
the
yeah.
we're only scratching the surface, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I said that we'll be
Yeah.
recording few more episodes in the future,
Mm.
as the progress goes on with this region. So yeah, thank you very much again for
Anytime,
coming on the
anytime.
podcast, and
Thank
I
you so
hope
much for having me.
yes, definitely. I look forward to have you again. Actually, maybe by the end
Thank
of
you.
this year, if the progress happens on this
Absolutely,
region,
absolutely.
we
Would
can
love to.
definitely record one more podcast. Yeah, thank
Absolutely,
you
no
very much,
problem
Aman.
at all. Thank
Yeah.
you. Have a lovely evening. Bye bye.